Alright, 2.01. So, in this first part, we're going to talk about the mercantilism and its consequences. So, watch out and try to describe how political and economic policies in Europe contributed to colonial rebellion. Try to do this by the end of the unit. And watch out for these keywords, including mercantilism, Adam Smith, navigation acts, salutary neglect, and impressment. Alright, so let's get straight. Let's get started right at the bat. Alright, you got this. Mercantilism. It is an economic system that builds wealth through a favorable balance of trade and taking advantage of colonial resources and markets. So what it pretty much does is take in the very cheap resources from the colonies and manufactures it there in the mother country and sells them back for finished manufactured goods. This went on in the Triangle Trade, where the colonies sent in raw materials, and they sent those raw materials to Europe. The raw materials were then used to make manufactured goods. They sent those to Africa and to North America. In Africa, they sent slaves to North America to make the raw materials, and this went on in a triangle, back and forth. Alright, so then the colonies were like, yo, why don't we just trade with other countries? We're selling all our products that are actually very valuable, very, very cheap to Great Britain, when we could be selling these products to Spain or France for much higher prices. But then Britain was like, nope, navigation acts. Now, they were forced to sell them to Great Britain, but there was another policy that was in states called salutary neglect, which was the freedom and self-governance in the colonies. They were kind of just like, do whatever you want there. They didn't really imply the navigation acts that much. Later on, there were many consequences of this. There was growth in colonial self-government and enlightenment and its first great awakening. But then after many times that they were caught of smuggling these products to other countries, impressment was put upon the colonists. This was where British practiced of forcing colonial men to serve in the navy. This led to colonial riots and this was popular before revolution, but did not continue after independence. It was tolerated during salutary neglect. Alright, not too much later after this, we get to the French and Indian War. What you're going to have to look out for in this unit is the causes and consequences of the French and Indian War, and special vocabulary to look out now and then is the Albany Plan of Union, the French and Indian War, of course, the Treaty of Paris, and the Proclamation Line of 1763. Got it? Let's get started right away. Alright, so the roots of the conflict, it was pretty much just border disputes between French and British, and they wanted to claim the Ohio River Valley. The natives, they sided with the French, as we learned before, and the colonists sided with the British. In 1754, the Albany Plan of Union was set. Franklin proposed a unified colonial government for common defense, but it was rejected by the colonists. They thought, nah, unnecessary, we don't need it. And this is where that famous poster, Join or Die, comes from, where the snake is all cut up in between the colonies. After that came the French and Indian War. This was in 1754 to 1763 between Great Britain and France over in the North American land. Early French victories were done because of the native support, but the colonists questioned Great Britain's military strength at this time. Later on, Great Britain had a huge comeback. British sent more and more soldiers and troops, and the Iroquois Confederacy joined them now. They were now British ally. Then the colonists were like, yes, we can finally move into the west, more land for us. But then Britain was like, nope. Proclamation Line of 1763 says you have to stay where you are. They don't want to send British troops over there to keep on protecting you. And now there was massive British debt, and they were like, hey, colonies, you trying to pay for this? And the colonists were furious. We'll get into that next. This is where frustration started to rise, as I mentioned before in my last video. Here we're going to determine how British policies led to the rebellion. Alright, let's get right into it. So, it was taxes on taxes after the French and Indian War. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and the colonies were frustrated as heck. The Sons of Liberty, they created a secret service. It was a group in Boston led by Samuel Adams to refuse all these taxes. Then came along the Stamp Act Congress. It was in 1765. It was the first colonial meeting to oppose taxes. No taxation without representation. That's where this line came around. And in Parliament, they repealed the taxes but passed the Declaratory Act. This declared Parliament's right to tax the colonies. Again, more frustration in the colonies. Then came along the Townshend Acts. There were new varieties of taxes, including the penny tax. This caused anger. There was a widespread boycotts of British goods and an increase in British soldiers in the colonies. This increased hostility and tension. And the tensions worsened. This started with the Boston Massacre in 1770, where there's a lot of different stories that came along with this, but pretty much it was just a clash of colonists and British soldiers, and 5 colonists were killed. And this was used as an anti-British propaganda. Then came along the British Tea Party, 1773. This sparked by the Tea Act, and it attempted to limit tea smuggling. The Sons of Liberty dumped 46 tons of tea into Boston Harbor. And the British were not too happy about that. They put on the colonists the Intolerable Acts. This is where they shut down the Boston Harbor. They put on the Quartering Acts, which forced colonists to house soldiers and placed Boston under martial law. After this, the colonists were like, alright, we need to settle this now. And they put up the First Continental Congress. They brought 13 delegates of all the colonies, and they talked about supporting protests and boycotts, defending rights to self-govern, prepare militias for defense, and meet again in 1775 if conditions worsened. But now, the fighting begins. Boom! Shots fired, and it was the start of the Battle of Lexington and Concord, the start of the American Revolution. This was in April 1775. Sadly, it was a Patriot victory, but it was the start of the American Revolution. They came out very, very disorganized, and they were all farmers and stuff like that, so they didn't really have that much fighting experience compared to the Redcoats. Then they had the Second Continental Congress. This was in the summer of 1775, and it was to create the Continental Army under General George Washington, and they discussed the independence. Shortly after this came the Battle of Bunker Hill in June 1775, and again, a British victory, but 2 times as many Redcoats were killed. And this increased the morale for the colonists by a lot. Then came the Oliver Branch petition in July of 1775. They were like, this was the last effort to get harmony again, to reject the battle. But the King of England was like, no, I want to fight. And they gave him a fight. Then Thomas Paine started to write the Common Sense, because there were still a lot of colonists in America saying, maybe we should side with the king. And Thomas Paine was like, are you dumb? Look what they're doing. How can they govern us if they're all the way on the other side of the world, and the little that they do is terrible for us? Come on now. This was written by Thomas Jefferson and was influenced by many Enlightenment thinkers, but mostly by John Locke. And then they started to form a government. They wrote the Articles of Confederation in 1777. It was the first governing document for America. Sadly, it was very, very bad. They only had one branch of government. It had a very, very weak central government, but strong state governments. Its purpose was to coordinate war efforts, form diplomacy, and to help continental currency. Alright, once again, we're back in the war. It's 1776 in August. It's the Battle of Brooklyn. Once again, a failure for the colonists, and it was a big failure. The Patriots lost in New York City New York City was now under British control, and Washington was pushed back all the way to Pennsylvania. The morale here was very, very low. Then Washington was like, all right, I need a special plan now to get myself back in business. He's traveled over the Denver River and ambushed Hessian mercenaries on Christmas Eve. They were never expecting it, and it was finally a Patriot victory. This was a huge morale booster because it was freezing at this time. They were walking around barefoot. They will later experience even worse battle, but this was the start of it. Then came along the Battle of Saratoga. This was a huge win for the colonists because now they got support from the French, and they were very important in this war. Some might say that they were even the cause of them winning the war. But then came along the winter of 1777 at Valley Forge. There was very low morale. Again, they lost, but they were walking around barefoot. I mean, can you imagine going into war, literally walking around like this? Would be horrible. I mean, it's snowing on the ground and you have to fight a war without feet, without shoes. Not without feet, that would be even worse. But now after they gained French support with Marquis de Lafayette, Frederick von Steuben, I mean, come on, our friends with white and black striped t-shirts, they came along and they helped quite a bit. This was now the summer of 1778 in Cornwallis. They had a campaign to regroup, to resupply, to retake these northern colonies. More loyalists, more slaves, free slaves to fight. But some of them actually fought for the British. But then came around December 1779 and the winning started. They captured Savannah. May 1780, they captured Charleston. 1781, the Battle of Cowpens, another great victory for the Patriots and made the British retreat all the way back to South Carolina. But another loss for the colonists in March. It was in the Battle of Guilford. It was a British victory, but the British were very weak after chasing Greene across North Carolina. But now, the Battle of Yorktown. All our French friends were back. It was finally the last battle, and it was a Patriot victory. Cornwallis surrendered. British Army. One of the final battles of the American Revolution. Now, why did the American win? They had a great leadership, my man George Washington, foreign support, British failures, suppression of loyalists. They had a home turf advantage. They knew where they were going, and the inspirational speeches given by George Washington. After the war, there was the Treaty of Paris in 1783. Now, Great Britain recognized America's independence. They established borders, but there was a problem. Some British troops, they wanted to stay in the US, and they were allowed to. There were several consequences after the American Revolution. There were social, political, and economical. But let's start with social. Now the Native Americans, most of them sided with Great Britain, and the Iroquois Confederacy was broken up. There was no representation of them in the Treaty of Paris, and they even lost land. African Americans, they sided for both, but most northern states, they abolished slavery, while in the South, not so much. Whoa. The women, they performed husband duties during the war. They wanted some more rights, but they weren't recognized as much. Although they did play a large role. In Republican motherhood, which was the expectation that mothers teach children patriotic morals and civic participation to create an American identity, which we all have in America now. I mean, do you see those fireworks on the 4th of July? Come on, USA! Now, they also had a group of Daughters of Liberty, which helped boycotts, which was also kind of similar to the Sons of Liberty, kind of copycats, but whatever. Then we had political consequences. The Articles of Confederation in 1777, this is where many of the consequences came from. It had a lot of weaknesses, including a weak central government, no federal taxation, and no national army, only state militias. And then the economic consequences. Post-war debt was huge. There were so many sales tax and state taxes, and this came because of 10 months of rebellion. Here came the Shays Rebellion. Daniel Shay was a Revolutionary War veteran and farmer who went into debt after the war because of the amount of tax that was placed on them. This showed the need for a more powerful federal government. And there you have it, kids. But now, why is it called the American Revolution? Why not American Rebellion? Think about it real quick. After many tedious hours of looking into this cause, I have concluded that it is actually a rebellion. Why, you may ask? Because I have compared it actually to the Shays Rebellion. Like the American Revolution, or should I say rebellion, they both had very large debts, they both had very high taxes, and they both had a very weak government. A central government, to be specific. And the consequence of actually the Shays Rebellion was that they proved that the opposing government was very weak. In this instance, the central government was very weak, and the Americans proved that the British government was very weak because they were too far away and they couldn't really control the Americans. And what they did control was harming them. Therefore, I believe that it was like a rebellion.